Late afternoon, July 23rd, 1944. The rolling fields near Saint-Lô, Normandy, were still thick with smoke from the morning barrage. A Sherman tank from the 3rd Armoured Division sat half-hidden behind a hedgerow, its olive-drab paint dulled by dust and streaks of cordite residue. The crew had stopped not because of enemy fire, but because of what lay ahead on the road. A destroyed German Panzer IV, its turret blown clean off, resting upside down in the ditch like a shell of some extinct creature. Staff Sergeant William "Red" Haskins climbed out of the commander's hatch, wiping sweat and grime from his face. The heat radiating from the blacktop made the air shimmer. He'd fought the Germans for months now, and every briefing, every intelligence circular, every rumour that filtered down through the ranks had described the Panzer IV as a dangerous but near-mythical machine. The backbone of German armour, the tank that had spearheaded blitzkrieg across Europe. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, standing before its wreck, he could see daylight through the holes in its hull. Private Raymond Torres, his gunner, crouched by the shattered side plate, tapping the armour edge with a knife. "Sir," he said, almost in disbelief, "it's thin. I can see the layers." Haskins knelt beside him. The armour had peeled open where an American 75mm round had struck just behind the turret. It wasn't thick at all, barely more than an inch. 30mm, he guessed. Maybe a hair more. He'd seen farm tractors with thicker plate on their ploughs. For months, American tankers had imagined the German panzers as nearly invincible beasts, products of an engineering culture that seemed decades ahead of their own. But this wreck, steaming in the summer heat, told a different story. What Haskins and his crew discovered that afternoon would ripple far beyond the hedgerows of Normandy. It revealed something deeper than a technical flaw. It exposed the fragile foundation of the German tank myth that had dominated Allied minds since the first encounters in North Africa. In that moment, the psychological balance on the battlefield began to tilt. Before the Normandy campaign, the American view of German armour was shaped less by experience than by fear. Reports from Kasserine Pass, from Salerno, from the desperate battles of 1943 painted the German tanks as near-supernatural instruments. Tiger tanks that shrugged off shells, Panthers whose guns could destroy a Sherman from 2,000 yards away. Intelligence summaries circulated through armoured battalions describing German steel as virtually impervious and their optics as unsurpassed in the world. By contrast, the M4 Sherman, America's mainstay, was seen even by its own crews as a compromise. Mobile, reliable, easy to repair, but undergunned and under-armoured. The men inside them knew the nickname whispered through the lines. Ronson, like the lighter, light's first time. And yet, by mid-1944, the battlefield reality was changing faster than anyone in the field manuals could admit. German industry was struggling under Allied bombing. Resources were dwindling. The once cutting-edge panzer divisions were filling their ranks with outdated models, including thousands of Panzer IVs, the same type that had first rolled across Poland 5 years earlier. The Panzer IV Ausf. H, the version most common in Normandy, carried a long-barreled 75mm gun capable of killing a Sherman at typical combat ranges. But its protection, especially along the sides, was far thinner than propaganda suggested. 30mm on the hull sides, 20mm at the rear. To offset this, the Germans had added thin skirts of steel called Schürzen, meant to detonate shaped charges before they reached the main armour. Against bazookas, they worked sometimes. Against kinetic rounds from a Sherman's 75mm gun, they were decoration. For most American tankers, this was not yet known. They had been told to fear German tanks, to engage from the flank only, and to call for artillery or air support whenever armour appeared. Training circulars repeated grim lessons from earlier battles. Do not duel a German tank frontally. Use terrain. Attack in numbers. But the summer of 1944 forced a new education. When the Allies landed in Normandy, they expected a slog against superior machines. Instead, they encountered a patchwork of German armour, some modern, some outdated, and many worn to the limits of mechanical endurance. Every destroyed vehicle told a story, and none surprised the Americans more than the Panzer IVs that littered the bocage after the first week of July. Lieutenant John Davidson of the 2nd Armoured Division recorded in his after-action notes on July 12th, "We came upon several knocked-out enemy tanks near the road to Saint-Jean-de-Daillard. Upon inspection, found the side armour to be much thinner than expected, estimated 1 inch. The men expressed disbelief that such a machine had caused us so much worry in North Africa." Davidson wasn't alone. Dozens of similar observations appear in battalion reports from July and August. Crews who had faced tigers or panthers knew their own shells would usually bounce harmlessly from the frontal plates. But when they examined Panzer IV wrecks, they found perforations everywhere from the sides, from the rear, sometimes even from top hits by artillery fragments. The myth of uniform German superiority was breaking down under the smell of burnt oil and cordite. What those tankers were really confronting wasn't just steel, it was the collapse of perception. The Panzer IV, first introduced in 1937 as a medium support tank, had been designed under a very different philosophy than the one guiding American armour. Its original purpose was to support lighter Panzer IIIs, using its short-barreled 75mm gun to destroy fortifications and infantry positions. Armour protection was secondary. Speed and manoeuvre were paramount. When the war expanded eastward and German tanks began facing the Soviet T-34, the design was hastily adapted: thicker armour, a long gun, added skirts, but the chassis had limits. Engineers at Krupp-Grusenwerk stretched its capabilities far beyond what the original plans envisioned. By 1944, each new layer of armour, each heavier gun, strained its engine and suspension to near breaking. In theory, the Panzer IV remained the workhorse of German armoured divisions. In practice, it had become an ageing machine, burdened with impossible expectations. A tank built for 1939, asked to fight in 1944 against weapons of an entirely new generation. The irony was that its American adversaries didn't yet realize this. That afternoon near Saint-Lô, Sergeant Haskins and his crew circled the wreck like archaeologists around a ruin. The smell of burnt fuel clung to the air. The Panzer's paint, once the sharp grey of German armour, was blistered from the explosion. Haskins ran his hand over a jagged penetration in the side plate, the entry hole no larger than his fist. "That was ours," he muttered. 75. High explosive. Straight through. He looked back at his own tank, the Sherman Marjorie, sitting in the field beyond. Its armour wasn't much thicker, but the revelation still hit him. All those months hearing about invincible panzers, and here was one torn open like a tin can. When the battalion's maintenance officers arrived later that day, they took measurements. 30mm, confirmed, with calipers. The report they filed would circulate up through command channels and eventually reach the Army's Ordnance Department in Britain, which by mid-August was compiling data from hundreds of destroyed German tanks. The results were startlingly consistent. Most Panzer IVs could be penetrated by standard M61 armour-piercing rounds from the Sherman's 75mm gun at ranges up to 800 yards, even through the front at times. For the first time in years, American tankers realized they didn't always need an ambush or a numerical advantage. They could win a duel on even terms. But this revelation did not come without cost. The understanding that German tanks were not uniformly superior meant confronting the larger truth that the war had turned from a contest of innovation to one of exhaustion. Every destroyed Panzer IV represented the shrinking capacity of the Reich to replace what was lost. The men didn't think in such terms then. They only saw what was in front of them, a machine once feared, now powerless. That night, as they bivouacked near the ruins of Saint-Lô, Haskins wrote a line in his small field notebook. "Panzer, not so tough. Maybe we've been giving them too much credit." He would later learn that across Normandy, hundreds of crews were writing similar thoughts. The morning mist hung low over the fields north of Saint-Lô, as a team from the 86th Ordnance Battalion arrived to examine what the tankers had found. They came in a jeep loaded with tools, notebooks, and calipers engineers, more than soldiers, men whose weapons were pencils and measuring tapes. Captain Robert Keller, a former machinist from Ohio before the war, crouched by the shattered hull of the German tank and began noting measurements with almost scientific reverence. The side armor, he confirmed, was 30 millimeters thick, barely over an inch. The upper hull measured 50 millimeters at its thickest point, sloped only slightly. Keller tapped the edge of a penetration with his pencil. Clean hole, armor-piercing capped round, probably M61, he said. Went through like butter. Nearby, 2 tankers from Haskins' crew watched silently. They'd spent months listening to radio chatter about German engineering miracles, about how panzers were supposed to be the pinnacle of mechanical warfare. But as Keller's men worked, the myth disintegrated in the summer air. The ordnance officers photographed every impact, sketched the trajectory of each hit, and compared them to the angles of engagement recorded in the battalion's after-action reports. By mid-July, similar examinations were being carried out all across Normandy. Knocked-out panzers, especially the IVs, became field classrooms for Allied technicians. The technical findings circulated quickly. The Panzer IV's main gun, the 75mm KGA-K-40, could penetrate about 90 millimeters of armor at 500 meters, enough to threaten any Sherman from the front. But its side protection was weak, a mere 30 millimeters of homogeneous plate, against standard American armor-piercing ammunition that offered little resistance beyond 600 yards. The myth of the invincible German tank had survived because so few Allied crews had ever seen a disabled one up close. When they did, the psychological balance shifted. In August, Ordnance Command published a classified technical report titled Preliminary Examination of Destroyed German Tanks, Normandy Theatre. Its tone was clinical, but the conclusions were quietly revolutionary. One section read, "Contrary to field assumptions, the Panzerkampfwagen IV presents multiple points of vulnerability to current US tank armament. The vehicle's side and rear armor may be penetrated at normal combat ranges by the M375mm gun. Crews should not assume inferiority of their own armament in engagements within 1,000 yards. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For tank crews who'd lived under the shadow of German reputation, those words were more powerful than propaganda. Yet the discovery was not just about metal, it revealed something about the men who built and fought in these machines. Keller's team found inconsistencies in the armor composition, uneven hardness, impurities in the steel, signs of hurried production. German metallurgical quality had declined since 1942, a casualty of overstrained industry and Allied bombing. Each Panzer IV was increasingly a compromise between ideal design and wartime necessity. The armor plates bore evidence of rushed welding, inconsistent riveting, and poorly finished edges. The once famed German precision was eroding, replaced by the telltale marks of a nation fighting with dwindling resources. It was not lost on the American observers. Keller noted in his field report, "The workmanship on this vehicle is below expectation. The quality of the plate and the finish of the welds indicate stress in manufacturing capacity. The side armor, in particular, shows signs of brittleness, likely due to overhardening." This was the sort of forensic evidence that told a deeper story, that German engineering, while advanced, was breaking under the weight of total war. By contrast, the American Sherman, often criticized for its simplicity, benefited from precisely that quality. Its armor was rolled and homogeneous, its mechanical parts interchangeable, its design consistent across thousands of units. The Sherman's strength was not in any one tank, it was in the system that built and maintained them. When Keller shared his findings with frontline officers, the mood in the division subtly changed. Crews who had once advanced cautiously began to engage German tanks with more confidence. Intelligence officers adjusted their field manuals to emphasize flanking attacks and close coordination rather than pure avoidance. Even General Rose of the 3rd Armored Division, known for his measured realism, noted in an internal memorandum that the Panzer IV no longer presents a serious threat to our armoured forces when met on open ground. Still, none of this erased the fear entirely. Combat was unpredictable, and even a thin-skinned panzer could kill with its first shot. But the aura of invincibility was gone. In late July, as the breakout from Saint-Lô began, Sherman crews drove past the burned hulks of German armour scattered along the roads. Some stopped to take photographs, others to study impact marks, tracing the arc of battle with their fingers. For men who lived by inches of steel and seconds of decision, those examinations were acts of quiet vindication. One corporal from the 33rd Armoured Regiment later wrote in a letter home, "You'd think their tanks were monsters from how we were briefed back in England. But they're not made of magic. We saw one open like a can where the round went through the side. If that's their best, then we've been fighting ghosts." The irony of that line would not have been lost on the German crews themselves. Many of them knew their Panzer IVs were outclassed by 1944. Veterans from the Eastern Front called them coffins on tracks. The Wehrmacht's reliance on them was born not from choice, but from necessity. Germany could build Tigers and Panthers in small numbers, but the Panzer IV remained the only tank that could be produced in volume. By the time of the Normandy campaign, over 8,000 Panzer IVs had been built, more than all Tigers and Panthers combined. It was the tank that fought everywhere, from North Africa to the Eastern Front to the hedgerows of France. But its ubiquity came at a cost: obsolescence. American tankers learned to recognize it instantly. The squat turret, the boxy hull, the distinctive side, skirts rattling loose as it moved. In motion, the Panzer IV looked confident. In destruction, it seemed fragile. When Allied intelligence officers compiled their reports after the campaign, they realized that the thin armor was only part of a larger revelation. The entire German armored doctrine was under strain. The combination of outdated chassis and overstretched logistics had turned the Panzer IV from a symbol of domination into a symbol of decline. In August, Keller's final report reached London. It included comparative data showing that the Sherman's 75mm gun, previously dismissed as inadequate, was more effective than assumed. Penetration tables demonstrated clear superiority at side angles under 1,000 yards. The psychological result of this single report rippled across armoured divisions in Europe. Training bulletins were revised. Lectures at replacement depots emphasized enemy weaknesses rather than invincibility. The message was simple, but transformative. The German tank can be beaten. For the men in the field, that message arrived in the form of confidence, not arrogance. They had seen too much destruction to underestimate any opponent, but they now fought with a clearer understanding of the truth, that superiority in war often lived in perception more than reality. By September, when Allied forces crossed the Seine and advanced toward Belgium, the once feared Panzer IVs appeared less frequently. Those that remained often served in defensive ambushes, hidden among rubble or behind walls, unable to maneuver freely. When they were destroyed, their hulks stood as mute evidence of a fading legend. In his final notes from the summer campaign, Captain Keller wrote, "Our soldiers once measured their courage against the myth of German machines. Now they measure it against their own endurance. The Panzer IV has not disappeared, it has simply become ordinary." That ordinary nature was its final irony. The tank that had launched blitzkrieg, that had rolled through Warsaw, Paris and Kiev, ended the war not as a symbol of invincibility, but as a relic of industrial desperation, still dangerous, still capable, but no longer decisive. For Sergeant Haskins and his crew, the revelation changed the way they fought, but more importantly, it changed the way they thought. The enemy's power no longer felt supernatural. War became what it always had been beneath the noise of propaganda and fear. A contest of endurance, of maintenance, of who could keep their machines running and their men alive a little longer. Months later, after the liberation of Paris, when the crew of the Marjorie rolled through the outskirts of the city, they passed another wrecked Panzer IV, its side armour torn away, the number 424 still faintly visible beneath soot. Haskins slowed the tank and looked out the cupola window. 30 millimeters, he muttered, almost to himself. Torres laughed quietly from the gunner's seat. Guess we finally measured the myth. The tank rumbled forward, the city opening before them, and behind them lay the scattered remains of a machine that had once terrified the world, but could no longer hide the truth written in its steel. By the time autumn came to northern France, the fields that had once echoed with gunfire were quiet, except for the sound of salvage crews. Teams of engineers and mechanics combed through the countryside, collecting wrecks German, American, British alike, each one a puzzle of twisted metal and human error. Among them were dozens of Panzer IVs, some burned to their frames, others abandoned intact. At depots near Cherbourg, Cayenne, and Liège, these tanks were hauled onto rail cars and sent to Allied test grounds. Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland received several by late October, their serial numbers still faintly visible under soot and grime. British analysts at the School of Tank Technology in Chertsey did the same, assigning each specimen a code name and a fate: disassembly, metallurgical testing, or live fire trials. For both nations, the objective was no longer fear, it was understanding. The engineers who had once revered German engineering as near perfect now approached it with a new skepticism. They cut through armor plates and discovered the wartime shortcuts that desperation had imposed. Where early war panzers had used high-quality nickel-steel alloy, late war examples relied on lower-grade steel hardened to compensate for impurity. The result was brittle armor that shattered more easily under stress. British reports noted that some weld seams were uneven, that the bolts securing the side skirts were soft enough to shear with hand tools. These details may have seemed trivial to outsiders, but to the men who had spent years fighting the German steel beasts, they were revelations. The myth had been built on an illusion of perfection. The wrecks revealed compromise. In November 1944, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department published a confidential document titled Technical Intelligence Summary No. 60, German Armored Vehicles, Current Evaluation. Within its pages lay the distilled lessons of countless battlefield examinations. The summary devoted an entire section to the Panzer IV, acknowledging its long service and adaptability, but concluding with a stark judgment. The Panzerkampfwagen IV, though capable of effective action under favorable conditions, represents an overburdened design at the end of its development cycle. Its armor protection is inadequate by current standards. Side armor of 30 mm constitutes a critical weakness against all U.S. and British tank guns at normal battle range. It was a bureaucratic sentence, but to those who had fought in Normandy, it read like closure. That winter, as American and British forces pushed into the Low Countries, the Panzer IV faded from the front lines. Panther tanks and a handful of Tigers took their place in the German order of battle, but even these newer machines carried the scars of strained production. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered not by propaganda, but by evidence by the steel remains of their own weapons. For the men who had lived through it, this realization altered more than tactics. It shifted their understanding of the enemy itself. Before Normandy, many Allied soldiers had seen the German army as a monolith, precise, disciplined, unstoppable. Now they began to recognize something more human, an army improvising under collapse, engineering brilliance yoked to dwindling resources. What they found in the ruins of German tanks were not superweapons, but symptoms of exhaustion. Sergeant Haskins, by then a veteran of the drive into Belgium, kept one small fragment from the Panzer IV they had examined near Saint-Lô. It was a jagged shard of steel, no bigger than his palm, cut clean from the side armour by the ordnance team. He kept it in his musette bag through the rest of the war. In quiet moments, he would turn it over in his hand, tracing the sharp edges, remembering how easily their shell had passed through. When the war ended, he mailed it home with a note. "Piece of a tank, they said we couldn't beat." Turns out it wasn't the tank, it was the story. That fragment told a truth larger than one battle. The legend of German engineering had been born from the early years of victory when the panzers had swept through Europe, when blitzkrieg seemed unstoppable. But war had changed faster than those machines could evolve. The Allies, with their factories unbombed and their supply chains intact, had achieved what German engineers could no longer afford: consistency. A tank like the Sherman might not have been beautiful or elegant, but it worked, and it kept working. In that difference lay the true measure of power. Post-war analyses would confirm what Keller's field teams had sensed. The Panzer IV's design had reached its limits by 1942. Every modification after that was an act of defiance against physics and production reality. German engineers knew it, but the army could not let go of a chassis that was too deeply embedded in its doctrine and industry. In early 1945, even as the Reich crumbled, new orders went out to produce more Panzer IVs, the same tank that had been found wanting months before. Most would never reach the front. The irony was bitter and unmistakable. The machine that had once symbolized German power now symbolized its futility. For historians who studied these events decades later, the episode at Saint-Lô became a small but telling footnote, a moment when perception gave way to evidence. It illustrated how much of warfare depends not only on what is true, but on what men believe to be true. The American tankers who knelt beside that shattered Panzer IV in the summer of 1944 didn't just uncover a weakness in armor plate. They uncovered the frailty of myth itself. Their discovery echoed far beyond Normandy. It influenced training doctrine for the rest of the war, and even into the Cold War era. U.S. Army manuals began emphasizing empirical analysis of enemy equipment, measure, test, verify rather than assumption or rumor. Combat experience had proven that belief could be as dangerous as any shell. At Aberdeen, engineers placed the captured Panzer IVs alongside Shermans, T-34 seconds, and eventually captured Panthers. They studied them not as enemies, but as machines, each reflecting a philosophy of war. The Panzer IV embodied ambition stretched past endurance, the Sherman, pragmatism and logistics. Both had strengths, both had flaws, but only one could be built, supplied, and repaired in the hundreds each week. In one of his final lectures before demobilization, Captain Keller addressed a group of young ordnance officers preparing for redeployment home. He pointed to a section of armor plate mounted on the wall, a salvaged piece from a Panzer IV. Its surface was scarred by impact tests, dull grey beneath the fluorescent light. This, he told them, is what's left when ideas meet reality. Every war leaves behind its relics. Don't mistake craftsmanship for strength or myth for truth. In the end, it's not the thickness of the steel that decides, but the endurance of the men who make it and the system that keeps it running. Those words, written down by an attendee, would later appear in a post-war ordnance bulletin titled Lessons from the European Theatre. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. In the ruins of Berlin, burned-out tanks littered the streets, Panthers, Tigers, and yes, a few surviving Panzer IVs, their once-feared silhouettes reduced to rust and silence. In the years that followed, the Panzer IV found an unlikely afterlife. Some were sold to foreign armies, others displayed in museums. In these new settings, stripped of their menace, they became artifacts, reminders of how even the most formidable machines are bound by time and circumstance. Visitors today who walk through the halls of Bovington or Aberdeen may see one of those tanks, its armor plate still bearing the scars of battle. Few notice the thinness of the side panels, the 30mm that once caused such surprise among American crews. But those who look closely can still trace the story hidden in the metal, the story of how soldiers learned to measure myth against reality, and in doing so, found a new kind of courage. For William Haskins, the war ended in the spring of 1945. He returned to Ohio, found work as a mechanic, and seldom spoke of the fighting. The small shard of panzer steel remained in a drawer beside his bed until his death decades later. His grandson, who found it among his belongings, described it in a letter to a museum. It's just a piece of grey metal, but he kept it all his life. I think it reminded him that even the things that scare us most can turn out to be ordinary when we finally see them up close. That sentiment, quietly preserved in a family drawer, captured the essence of what so many soldiers learned in those years, that fear and reverence are both built on distance, and that understanding hard-earned and unsentimental is what dissolves both. The Panzer IV was more than a tank. It was a mirror held up to the myth of German invincibility, and by extension, to the illusions that define every war. Its 30mm side armour, measured with calipers in a Norman field, became a symbol of revelation. When Haskins' crew first saw sunlight shining through the holes in that armour, they were not just seeing a defeated machine, they were seeing through the stories that had shaped their fear. And in that clarity, amid the wreckage and smoke of Normandy, the war itself became something different, not a struggle between legends, but between men and the machines they believed in. And that is how the myth of the invincible Panzer ended, not with a grand duel or a secret weapon, but with a handful of American soldiers kneeling beside a wreck in a French field, measuring 30mm of steel, and realizing that even the strongest armor in the world cannot protect an empire built on illusion. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.